So thanks for coming along today to this talk about microservices and security. My name is Sam Newman. I wrote a book about microservices. You might be able to buy it at the O'Reilly stand now that the books have actually arrived. I'm now an independent consultant working for my own company, Sam Newman & Associates. I'm available for training, consulting, coaching, bar mitzvahs. I can do a really bad stand-up, and I'm lousy at magic, but please do ask me afterwards because I need to pay rent. Now, before we go on, I just want to ask a quick question of the people in the audience. How many people here are doctors? Can anyone put their hand up if they're a doctor? And I mean like a real doctor, a medical one, not like a computer science doctor. You're not a real doctor. Like someone someone that's an epidemiologist, someone that studies infectious diseases. Anybody here played? Okay, let's try sort of a lower barrier. Has anyone here played Pandemic? Has anybody here played Pandemic? Okay, well, a few of you played. So a few of you here are experts in the field. But no, here's the thing, right? So I'm going to ask another question. How many people here know how important it is for you to wash your hands after you've been to the toilet? So A, not everybody's hand is up, which is really concerning. And I didn't even ask the hard question, which was how many people actually wash their hands after they go to the toilet. I asked the question of how many of you think at least it's important. And even then, not everybody's hands go up. That said, a lot of you did put your hands up, and the vast majority of the people here are not experts in the field of medicine or bacteria or viruses. You have a base level of understanding about what you need to do to keep yourself healthy. It includes things like washing your hands. The reason I bring this up is I think we as sort of software professionals, after a fashion, have taken this stance towards security, which is, oh yeah, security, well, I don't do security. What we do is you get an expert in and they do security for you, or often to you. So you build your thing, and then you say, here's my thing. Can you now sprinkle the security on top? And it'll all be fine. And it's actually where we are now, where we were, say, 10 years ago with, say, usability or testing, right? And it used to be we'd write some code, and we'd give it to a tester and say, I don't need to check that my code works. You can do that for me. And now we realize that, yes, you need specialists in tests, but we actually also have an understanding of what kind of automated tests we should be writing. We write a lot of them ourselves as well. Just like we're getting better at thinking about our customer, getting better at usability, we still have specialists. But in the space of security, we sort of abdicate all responsibility for any security-related aspects and just assume that somebody else is going to sprinkle it in for us because it's really hard and it's quite specialist, you know? I wouldn't want to get in their way. And this talk, hopefully, is going to give you some basic models for thinking about application security that will apply equally well, whether or not it's in the context of microservices or any other kind of software you're working on. So you're going to get some base knowledge. I'm going to make you all, at least, when it comes to security, conscious incompetence, which would still place you in the upper echelons of the industry, because at least you'll be aware of all the stuff you don't know, but also have a few little things you can do that will absolutely make your applications safer and easier to use. So that's me, being enthusiastic, making you feel good about yourselves. You'll come out of here empowered. But this is a talk about security, so I also do need to scare you just a little bit. So how many people here have seen this thing before? This is the Norse attack map, right? Now, this is awesome. This is something else you can do. When you go back to your offices next week, and you've got to justify coming to this conference, you launch this thing on your desktop, and then when your boss asks you what you're doing, you'll say, I'm doing security. So this is like a live map of attacks that are happening, which hopefully will play for me. This is actually, I capped this from a couple of years ago, and it's showing all the live attacks that are just going on the internet. It's the background radiation almost. So just, if you put a website out there and it's publicly available, things are going to happen to it. And wait for it, there we go. Somebody got really annoyed at somebody in the Middle East. Who'd have thought that, right? I thought it was all quite calm and placid there. And so you can watch these things happening, and there they go again. My laptop at this point was running at about 400% and was slowly hovering off the table because of the fans that were whirring. This is the background noise of what's going on out there. The question isn't if someone's going to try and attack your site, it's when. And these may not be malicious things. They may just be script kiddies, people running things like the low-orbit ion cannon, or just, people just screwing around looking for unpatched servers. This is the world you operate in, and you have to be prepared to defend yourself against it and also know what to do if something bad does happen, if someone does breach your defenses. But we're going to talk about security in the context of microservices. And so I always give a definition of what microservices are. And I talk about them like this. I talk about them as being small, autonomous, small, independently deployable services that work together modeled around a business domain. Just so we're on the same page about what they are. So independent processes, things that we try and deploy and change independently, may or may not have different technologies to each other, but sort of we build our applications out of connections between these services. And they actually, from a point of view of security, we have some fundamental advantages of the microservice architecture. With a more monolithic system, all of your sensitive information, your sensitive processing, your data is sort of all in one place. All of your information is in one database. All of the sensitive processing is in one process. So if someone gains access to that information, they've got everything. They've got all of your stuff. Your most important stuff and your least important stuff is all there in that one big monolithic system. Whereas with a microservice architecture, you get this property of isolation. That means that you can isolate your more sensitive data in certain services, which you could then apply more protections to. But equally, if someone gains access to one of those services, they've only gained access to one of those services. And so this idea of defense in depth, something we use again and again in the context of security and prevention, comes to the fore. We have lots of opportunity to defend our applications in depth. The flip side, of course, of the microservice architecture is that we've also drastically increased the surface area of attack. All this information that used to flow over processes and flow within a process between method calls and the like is now flowing over network boundaries. This is information that on many people's corporate networks is now just visible in the open. Anybody on your corporate network can sniff that traffic, can read it, could maybe even manipulate the payloads. I've been to organizations where they encrypt their database, but they send them information over unencrypted HTTP. And it's like, well, I don't need to go to your database. I can just sit on your network and make calls to your service. And you've got a nice API, and you've documented it using Swagger. So you make it really, really easy for me to get your data. Aren't you kind? And this is the problem. This sort of give and take that we have with the microservice architecture is something we kind of do need to be able to navigate in this context. So I'm going to present a model that some old colleagues of mine came up with when thinking about application security. And it's a 4-part model. And we're going to look at that in the context of a microservice architecture and understand what we can do with these architectures to secure them. But as I say, a lot of this advice is generic for any kind of application you might be building. And it starts with thinking about prevention. This is often where we focus all of our attention, just in the field of stopping the bad thing from happening. But we have to recognize that we're not infallible, and sometimes a malicious attacker might breach our perimeter, might gain access to our information, so we need to know when that's happened. We need to be able to detect that happening. Once we've found out that a breach has occurred, for example, we need to know how to respond to that. This is mostly people stuff. This is mostly about communication. And finally, once we've responded, we need to know how to recover, how to repair our systems, how to get back to running operation. And when you're thinking about sort of a balanced stance towards application security, you need to be putting effort into all of these spaces, not just focusing on one of these boxes. And unfortunately, all too often, we tend to spend all of our time, attention, looking at this one box of prevention. And this is also problematic because it turns out that we as human beings are very, very bad at assessing risk. So a few years ago, I was working for a client, and it was post-Snowden, and so everyone was a bit more aware of the concerns around data privacy and malicious attackers gaining access to your information. And so they created an internal InfoSec team that was looking at amongst other things like premise security. There was a realization that the corporate networks were quite open, and therefore, if you gained physical access to the building, you could tap into the corporate network and get access to all kinds of useful things. And so what they were trying to do was sort of deter people from coming into buildings that this company owned, and also be able to work out whether or not something has happened. So after a breach, did someone come into our office we didn't know about? And they wanted to put CCTV cameras in the foyers of all of these offices. And this particular organization, when this was floated, this caused a sort of a technical term, a shitstorm of protest. People going, oh, you don't trust us. Why are you spying on us? You're just like the NSA. Do you not trust what we're doing? Where's this recording going to be going? Who's going to be looking and watching this stuff? And this went on for a couple of weeks, and these InfoSec people, who were very well-meaning, were sort of like, well, okay, trying to defend themselves. And then one of the offices said, before we spend thousands of dollars on CCTV, maybe we should make sure that our front door lock works. Because it turns out that for a couple of years, the front door of this office in Australia, the lock didn't work. And so the door would regularly, you'd come back in after, overnight, and you'd come back in the morning and find the wind had blown the door open. And it was pointed out that maybe spending $200 on a locksmith to repair the lock was significantly more likely to help prevent against someone gaining access to your premises than several $1,000s on an IP-based camera system. And this goes to the heart of the problem we have when thinking about prevention, is that human beings are very, very bad at assessing risk in general. Especially when it comes to security, we go after the shiny stuff without realizing where we actually are vulnerable. This is where something like threat modeling comes into play. One technique used in threat modeling is this thing called attack trees. Bruce and I came up with this idea almost 20 years ago now. And the idea is that what you do is you think about the goal that a malicious attacker is trying to achieve. And then you enumerate the ways in which they could gain access to that thing. So in the example from his original paper, the goal that the malicious attackers are trying to gain access to, the thing they want to open the safe. They want to gain access to all of my conference lanyards that I've been collecting over the last several years. And so you start enumerating the ways in which they could gain access. How could they gain access to my safe? Well, they could pick the lock, they could learn the combination, or they could cut the safe open. You could keep going. How could they learn the combination? Well, you could find it written down. That seems likely, doesn't it? We write that stuff down a lot. We could also get the combination from the target, and that all gets a bit Jason Bourne-y. How could you get the combination from the target? Well, you could blackmail them, you could threaten them, you could bribe them. InfoSec and app security people tend to be quite paranoid individuals, but this is a mix of sort of technical aspects and people aspects. And once you've enumerated the different ways in which someone could gain access to your target, you start applying weights and thinking rationally. So in this example, just a rough approximation of how expensive it might be to an attacker. And this is actually what you're doing a lot. What you're often trying to do is not make something impossible to an attacker. You're just trying to raise the cost of them doing something so high that it's no longer economically viable for them to gain access to that information. This is why we use long keys to encrypt information. We're not saying those keys are uncrackable. It's just that you might need so many machines to crack that key that it would cost you an absolute fortune to be able to break that key open, given the information that's available inside. And so in this example here, we suddenly realize, actually, the easiest thing for them to do is to find the combination written down. And then you can start thinking rationally about how do we stop people having to write that combination down? What are the things that we could do? Maybe the example here is now use a fingerprint or an iris lock for your safe. Again, overkill for my lanyards. So let's start looking, actually, though, at some mechanisms around protection. With that in mind, we'll look at some mechanisms for protection of a microservice architecture. So this is a very simple little architecture. I've used this one before. This is a site that sells CDs online. We have some stuff inside our perimeter here, which sort of represents, our sort of internal services. There's a service over here, which is a third-party gateway, which is where we send information about the music we've been streaming. So that's a trusted third party. And at the top here, we've just got the external clients. The first thing I said earlier was that when we move to a microservice architecture, information now flows over our networks. We have to start thinking very carefully about transport security. And not everybody, but a lot of people use some form of HTTP communication between services. And so we start thinking about what protections that we can place around that sort of thing. And here, of course, we start talking about things like this, HTTPS everywhere, actually running HTTPS over the connections inside your organization. The idea being then that you limit what a malicious party could do. You do, though, need to understand what running TLS over your services actually gives you. What it gives you is server guarantees, so that as a client, I know the server I'm talking to is actually the server I'm talking to, assuming you've done the right things with your certificates. And it also gives you some guarantees about whether or not people have manipulated the payloads between client and server. It doesn't give you any guarantee that the client you're talking to is actually who you think the client is. So a malicious party on your network could still connect one of your HTTPS services. Nonetheless, this has become much easier. People used to complain about how difficult it was. But now there are lots of solutions for you to automate creation and management of server-side certificates to provide TLS-type capability. How many people here have heard of Let's Encrypt? A show of hands, right? So yeah, Let's Encrypt's been around for a while now. It's a free implementation of the Acme protocol. And when Let's Encrypt came out, everyone got really, really excited. And they got excited about something I found was quite odd. Let's Encrypt is a free, automated, and open certificate authority. And everyone said, oh, look, It's free. Ah, free. As though it's the $30 certificate charge per year that was stopping you from implementing HTTPS on your services. No, it wasn't the $30. It was the automation. That's the important part. $30 is nothing. It's a drop in the ocean for some peace of mind. The ACWI protocols, where things get interesting, you have a full command line, an API that's now being supported by other certificate authorities that allows you to automate issuing brand new certificates and also renewing them. There's even a one-liners to do things like install those certificates in things like Nginx and Apache. This drastically lowers the barrier to entry for using Let's Encrypt both in your public-facing HTTP-based websites and also your internal HTTP-based web services, and starts becoming a bit of a no-brainer to run inside your perimeter. The arguments around performance are pretty much moot at this point because they don't really exist. Hardware has improved drastically. So the idea that these actually incur a big overhead is sort of gone by the wayside. I did mention, of course, that these certificates only give you server-side validation. You don't get any validation on the point of the client. So in other words, if I'm a secure server, you're connecting to me, I don't actually know who you are. So I need to know who you are if I want to stop a malicious party or some untrusted party accessing my information. So one of the things that's being used increasingly in this space is now client-side certificates. Again, this has been something which historically has been quite problematic. But again, we're getting tools and solutions now to help us automate these kinds of things. So making use of things like Netflix's Lima system, which is basically a broker technology, an automation broker technology that sits between you and the underlying certificate authorities. So out of the box, it supports Amazon's certificate stuff. And so this means you can automate, when you bring up a service, you can automate installation of client-side certificates. So it's a really interesting piece of technology, and I know other people that have done the same by automating directly on top of things like Amazon. Even if you're in an environment where installing these certificates is a manual job, it can still be worthwhile, especially, for example, if you're communicating with things that are outside of your perimeter. If you're talking to other services over the public internet, it might make sense for you to manually install and configure these client-side certificates on sort of perimeter appliances to get that stuff running. But ideally, you want to look to automate these things as well. We should, of course, talk about one of the big topics in this area, which is what you do around auth, specifically authorization and authentication. And this is actually quite a deep topic, but I really want to hone in on one particular issue that can cause some real issues in a microservice architecture. And now, of course, when we talk about client-based authentication, we're looking at the traditional things. We're looking at things like, OAuth-based authentication for mobile devices, form-based auth for web devices. And at that point, you log in, and you get redirected to a login page. You log in, you validate your identity. Yes, it's Sam who's logged in. And then the music web shop says, great, you've got the appropriate token. I understand that you are Sam. Welcome aboard. And now you can access information exposed here from our music web shop. But things get much more interesting in a microservice architecture, of course, because many of the things that you might do as a user will cause the music web shop to actually make calls downstream to another service. This example, the user service. And that opens us up to some interesting attack vectors. So, here's how it normally works. I go log in with the web browser and say, hi, it's me, I'm Bob. And the music web shop goes, great. Hi, Bob, you're logged in. And then sometime later you go, can I see my user details, please? And the music web shop goes, sure, I'll go and fetch those for you from the user service. And the music web shop goes to the user service and says, please can I have the information? And the user service goes, well, of course you can. I know who you are. You're the trustworthy music web shop. I know who you are. I know it's you, the music web shop. We're all in this together. And so here's the information you want because I trust you deeply. And up that information all bubbles up, and you now got access to your user information. And then Bob starts getting funny about this. He goes, what if I ask, can I have Alice's details? Now, the key thing here is that the Alice's details are not stored in the music web shop. They're stored somewhere else. They're stored in another service. So unless the music web shop knows what it's allowed to ask for downstream services, which in many cases it doesn't, it's just going to send the request on. Hi, user service, can I have Alice's details? And in this example, the user service just implicitly trusts the upstream service and goes, yeah, of course you can. Here you are, here's Alice's details, and all is well, and all is good, and we've just exposed a whole load of private information we shouldn't have. This is an example of what's called the confused deputy problem. Effectively, you have a deputy that you're using. You're tricking a person in the middle, a party in the middle, into giving you information that they shouldn't. And typically the way we start solving this nowadays is using something called JWT tokens or something like that, where when you log in, you get a token that represents you and the things that you're allowed to do. And then when, say, in this previous example, the web shop is making calls to the user service, it passes that token for me or Bob downstream, and then the services downstream can look at that token and work out whether or not, based on that user's credentials, they should give them that information. This is often the issue that the services themselves are the only people that really know what you're allowed to do. And so you need to almost revalidate that for each subsequent call. Data at rest actually can become much easier in this world. When we think about data at rest, we're thinking about often encryption of databases and things. That often does come with a performance penalty. And you start doing things like only encrypting certain tables, certain columns, certain relationships. And then you get all these weird things where you find out you're actually leaking information in relationships you'd forgotten to encrypt and those sorts of things. Of course, with this kind of world, it's much easier because often you find that your PII, your personally identifiable information, is much more concentrated in certain services. And you just say, well, let's just encrypt everything at rest in the user service and just don't worry about it. It's a small enough data set compared to the rest, and the rest of it we don't really care about. It's fine. I'll skip this thing. The other areas around prevention, which I think are becoming much easier to work with, is actually in the area of tools, in the area of automated tools. Historically, tooling in the security space was pretty awful and was mostly, the idea of an automated tool was, I'm going to run this thing on my site, and it's going to generate a 400-page PDF report that you then have a crew of consultants analyze and tell you what actually happened. We're now seeing significantly better prevention mechanisms and sort of things like static analyzers like Brakeman. You've got things like the OWASP attack proxy, things that can look for cross-site scripting attacks. You can now start running these things in your build process yourselves. So on every check-in, you're getting some validation about whether or not you've opened yourselves up to certain security vulnerabilities. And this is something that's becoming increasingly popular, and you should definitely keep your eye open for. Another place I think is a great resource, especially when you're trying to understand about things like threat modeling, is Microsoft's secure development lifecycle. They've got a load of excellent information about threat modeling techniques like Dread and Stride. Some of the stuff can be a little bit waterfall-y. I think that's a bit unfair, though. It's getting a lot better. But there's some really easy things that you could do in your team right now. Just run through a couple of these exercises and thinking about your product and come out with some fairly good insight into where you might be vulnerable and what sorts of things you should actually do. I will, of course, though, say the most important thing that you can possibly do in terms of stopping a malicious party gaining access to information they shouldn't. How many people here patch all of their services at least once a week? 2 people? How many do it once a month? How many people don't know how often they patch their servers? Right, it's a lot more people putting their hands up. The vast majority of breaches and things that often occur as a result, they're not 0 days. They're often known vulnerabilities that were patched months and months ago. And, bots and things out there on the internet find vulnerabilities in machines that are unpatched, and they gain access to your information like that. All main operating system vendors will release patches on a weekly basis. If you're not patching your services on a regular basis, you're leaving yourself open to a whole load of known vulnerabilities. This is the simplest and easiest thing you can do to protect yourself. In the land of Docker and immutable servers, this gets quite interesting because we create these Docker images and we deploy them and we see them as immutable, and we won't touch them again until we come out with a new version of our software. What that means, though, is that those services are out there running with unpatched vulnerabilities in them. So I don't see many people using Docker who are actually tearing those things down and rebuilding them once a week or once every 10 days, even when their server code hasn't changed, just to make sure they've got the latest version of the patches. So just something to bear in mind. It's not all about stopping a bad thing from happening. It's also about, once that has happened, knowing that it's happened. So we have to think here about detection. One of the first things you can do in the area of detection is start looking at vulnerabilities that are announced around the platforms and the tools you are using. So things like Qualies and all those sorts of services are great to look at. There's even some really interesting sort of startups now that are analyzing the dependencies of your code bases and telling you when you depend on libraries that have critical vulnerabilities in them. So one of those tools I like called SNCC, for example, it will monitor your GitHub repo, private or public, and if it sees that there's a CVE's been issued in one of the libraries and there's a new version available, they'll email you to alert you. They'll also automatically create a pull request that allows you at a click of a button to upgrade all of your dependencies to the new patched versions of things. The excuses for not patching your application dependencies have kind of fallen away as a result. But nonetheless, you do kind of need to be aware of some of the nasty vulnerabilities as they come out, because often they're only discovered a while after they were first introduced. Shell shock, for example, was a bug that was found in the bash shell, and that had been around for a couple of years. And so we knew potentially attackers out there could have been using these things in anger. They could have actually been gaining access to our systems through this vulnerability that was there for a long period of time. And I remember talking to one of the in-house InfoSec people at ThoughtWorks, and was saying, well, how would we know? And he said, actually, the best thing for us to do would be to look at our logs. So using something like aggregated logging, both of your services and your operating system stacks, maybe in something like the ELK stack, can be really beneficial, because you can often look in those logs for traces of these sorts of attacks. Even the absence of logs from machines can tell you something. But if you're not collecting these logs, you're kind of flying blind a bit. It's also worth pointing out that often the log retention cycles that we want as application developers, or that you might want for production support, that might be quite small windows. We might only be keeping things for a few weeks. Whereas for the security people, they might want to keep these logs around for 3 to 5 years. So actually thinking about how long you keep those log files around for, that's useful information for working out what's going on. You also have more active detection mechanisms. You have things like application firewalls, like mod security. And what they can do is actually detect machines acting in odd ways, trying to communicate over odd ports and alert you about them. These sorts of appliances are both about prevention and also detection. Oh, this thing's acting oddly. You should probably do something about that. But you can, of course, use these sort of perimeter devices at multiple different points in your application stack. When it comes to detection, and prevention as well, I sort of feel that, again, microservices have this odd, they give and they take. Because often one of the things we talk about in the context of microservice architecture is this idea that it opens up the possibility of us being polyglot. So being able to use lots of different technologies and lots of different databases and programming languages. The problem then, of course, is that's many, many more things for you to track. There's a load more dependencies you've got to keep an eye on. Have these things been patched? Oh no, there's a new version of Ruby out. We've got to get that patched. Oh, all that stuff going on. And if you don't have a high degree of rigor around automation and rolling these things frequently, this could leave you open in a lot of different ways. On the flip side, if you're an organization that is really good at all that sort of stuff, polyglot is also more things that need to be broken. An exploit that cracks open a Java service is not necessarily going to work against a Ruby service. And so I sort of remain sort of on the fence around polyglot in general for most organizations. But especially in terms of security, I'm not quite sure where we should go. We should talk now about response. And response is something that is not really, this section is not in any way, shape, or form microservice specific. But what it is specific to is human beings. We are all, hands up if you're a human being. Again, not everyone's hands are going up here, which makes me think you're not. So someone's waving. That's great. Thank you very much. So we are all human beings here, and this is a great example of how we often get things wrong in the heat of the moment, and also how we don't always respond to the things that are right in front of us. How many people have heard of this company before? So this is Target. They're a very big US retailer. They operate in some other territories as well. And a few years ago, they were breached, and they were breached quite badly. What happened was a large amount, or basically for a period of time, all of the credit cards that were used in their stores were basically hacked, and someone stole them all. Now, this wasn't a typical breach. This wasn't a breach where someone gained access to your database and stole the information and ran off with it. What happened here was a fairly sophisticated piece of malware got installed on the electronic point-of-sale systems that were running in Target stores. And so what that meant was that as you scanned your card, the malware would capture your card information there and then. It would store that for a while, and then at a certain point in time, it exfiltrated it all out of the network. Exfiltration is the kind of word you use a lot when looking into application security. I think I learned that from CSI Cyber, which has now sadly been cancelled. But anyway. And the kind of interesting thing about the Target example is not the nature of the hack. It's the fact that they knew it was happening, and they knew it had happened, and then did nothing about it. In fact, it was only, I think it was someone in Congress or the Senate who basically said that you have to tell people about this stuff. There's actually a lot of countries we operate in don't have mandatory reporting laws around data breaches. You're not actually under an obligation to let your customers know a lot of the time that someone's stolen your credit card data, and they were forced into it. Eventually, the CEO actually lost their job over this. The really interesting thing about the Target case is not just that they didn't get in front of the situation, it's also that they saw the thing happening, and they could have prevented it. Unlike many retailers at this time, they had their own dedicated in-house security team. That team was running software called FireEye out in, and I think the team was based in Bangalore. And they saw the malware being installed on the electronic point of sale systems and said, malware being installed. There's people installing malware on our till. Anybody? Hello? Is this on? Anybody there? And no one listened to them. And then they saw the information then being taken out of their tills and sent out. And they said, data, credit cards go by. Hello? No? Oh, okay. We'll go back to our dashboards. And they saw this, they detected it, and they did nothing about it. It's a fantastic example of how we often don't wire in these sort of detection mechanisms to our organization. They just report into the wrong part of an organization. There was lots of stuff going on. Yes, I know your thing's important, but everything's important right now. And this idea that you can have these teams that are doing their job and are just not being listened to is quite galling. By the way, if you want to know more about these kinds of breaches and also what happens on the dark web and how much you can get for a stolen credit card, I thoroughly recommend Brian Krebs' blog, Krebs on Security. He covered this hack and many other hacks in a lot of detail. A lot of this does come down to comms. It does come down to a communication between you and your customers. So who has heard of this website? There's a couple of people. Some hands went up very quickly there, by the way. So this is a rather interesting story. It's quite a salacious story, a website where people in long-term relationships can meet other people in long-term relationships for whatever, games of chess, I think is what it was all about. And they got hacked. So what happened was these hackers came out and said, we've got all your data. We've got every single bit of data you've got. And Adjective Master said, no, you don't, you're all making it up. And they go, we absolutely do have your data. And then they went, OK, you've got a little bit of our data, but that's all you've got. And the hackers go, no, we've got all of it. And we've shown it to all your security researchers. And they say we've got all of it too. And then Adjective Master go, oh, OK, you've got all of our data, but that's all you've got. Oh, OK, you've also got all of our emails as well. Oh, and OK, you've also got the production source code. And what happened was this sort of drip and drip feed of information, this sort of blanket denial. No, we don't. No, they don't. They're making it all up. OK, they're not making it all up. OK, they're not making any of it up. But it's all fine. Stretch this story out for weeks and weeks and weeks. And rather than just getting out in front of it, and saying, look, something bad happened. This is really not good. We really do apologize. We're looking into it. We don't know everything right now. We're going to let you know, but we're really on top of this. Making you feel better that someone's actually taking your stuff seriously and having empathy for you as a customer, they sort of dithered. This is sort of in direct contrast to how other organizations handle failure. Some of you may remember Tylenol in the US. It's a pretty old story now, but there was a rather unfortunate situation where a number of people died as a result of Tylenol, which is the most popular off-the-shelf pain medication, was poisoned, and some people died. I think 7 people in Chicago died. And Johnson & Johnson, the company behind Tylenol, immediately withdrew Tylenol from across the shelves all across America. The recall cost them over $100 million. They yanked it all from the shelves. There was no evidence that this was systemic. There was no evidence that the supply chain had been compromised. For all people knew it was a localized issue. But they pulled it from the shelves across the country. They immediately came out with things like tamper-resistant cells and tamper-resistant capsules to make it harder for people to break capsules open and tamper with them. And when they put it back out on the shelves, it went straight to the top of being the most popular pain meds again. Because customers realized that this company cared, they were worried about it, they'd gone above and beyond in terms of actually keeping these people safe. That's what you do. You get out in front, you do the right thing, and you will often get rewarded for it. I think we all accept that the companies that we get services from, will sometimes make a mistake. The issue is how you deal with it when you do. And often what we don't do is we don't think about how to handle the bad situations until they actually occur. And when the bad situation is happening, everybody else is running around like a headless chicken. You're not going to sit down and write a calmly worded email that puts people at rest when everyone's going, oh, the sky's falling, we're all going to die. Another great example of that would be Adult Friend Finder, another website where friends who are adults can find other friends that are adults for adult fun. Again, chess, maybe drafts. This site allowed you to express what you would like in a fair amount of detail. All of this information, 400 million records, were stolen. And one of the main execs came out, and he said, don't worry, don't worry. They didn't get your credit cards. Because obviously the thing you worry about is they might have my credit cards because what happens then, I report it to the bank, and then they give me the money back that was taken off my credit card, and then I have my credit card again within 7 days. This information was out there on the public internet. It's still out there now. You had co-workers looking up other people's, our co-workers' email addresses in this data breach, looking for what they may have said on the website. That's a genie that doesn't go back in the bottle, but it's a staggering lack of empathy from one of the main people behind this website to assume that it was the credit cards that people were actually worried about. So let's move on now to talk a little bit about recovery. So we've done our best to protect ourselves. We've defended in depth. We've encrypted our information at rest. We've protected it in transit. We've made sure we can find out whether or not we've actually been breached. We're grabbing all these logs. We're looking at exception traces coming out. And we're really great at response. Actually, I think for response, one of the best things you could do if you're not going through a breach right now, is sit down together and say, what would happen if someone got access to all of our data? What would we do? What email would we write? Let's write that email now when everyone's calm. Who's they going to send that email? Okay, we write it now, because then when the sky's falling, you can send that nice email out. And do it like on a Friday, a couple of drinks, you have a nice time, not when the sky's falling. But we've done that, we've responded correctly, but still we've got to recover. We've got to pick up the bits of what's left of our organization after this situation. We have to recover. Well, I know this stuff feels, kind of basic, but you've got backups, right? I'm asking all of you, you've got backups, haven't you? And those backups are tested, right? You test those backups. WannaCry, it was a crypto locker. Oh no, they've encrypted all my files. So what? Burn it down, restore for my backups before I got crypto locked. I don't have to lose any Bitcoin. But people don't do this, do they? They don't have backups for information. Has anyone here heard of a company called Codespaces? No one has, because they don't exist anymore. Because their whole system was running on Amazon, a single Amazon account, and no one's quite sure who, but it was someone gained access to the main API credentials for that account, and they deleted all their production servers. They deleted all of the information in that account, wiped out every single Amazon resource. And so, of course, you'd say, well, you've got backups, right? And they said, yes, we have got backups. It was on the same Amazon account. Their source code was on that Amazon account. Their whole company went under in like a fraction of a minute, basically, with someone just wiping the whole thing out. So you need to have backups. Those backups probably need to be stored off-site. In Amazon speak, that could be a separate account. You need to test that they work. Also, once this sort of thing happens, burn the whole thing down. You're never quite sure what remnants are left behind. A lot of rootkits, for example, will leave little traces of themselves around. They'll do nasty things, like they'll install their own software running on your machine, and then they'll patch the commands that you would use to find out if malicious stuff is running on your machine. One of the first times one of my machines got rootkitted, it was like literally they'd patched PS and LS. Whenever you did a listing, it would just not show you the files it didn't want you to see. And the only answer we had was to burn the whole thing down. And of course, you're all building your machines from source code that's checked into a version control repository, right? You're using Puppet or Chef, or you're building things from scratch using Docker. You can fully automate the creation of your services, can't you, from source code? Because that's what we do nowadays. Because if you can do that, and you think something bad might have happened, and you're not even sure, screw it, burn the whole thing down, put a match to it. You recover from known backups, you pull your software out, you rebuild your system from software that's checked in, that can be looked at and validated and understood and reasoned about, and you rebuild your whole infrastructure. Now, of course, this is something that can be really problematic with a microservice architecture. If you've got maybe one service or one monolithic process to burn down and recreate, this isn't too hard. We're not trying to do it with a whole huge stack. This is incredibly difficult. I think for some organizations, when they start adopting microservices, they sort of hold off on doing a lot of the automation things. And I think maybe early on that's understandable. But if you're in a situation where you've got multiple processes talking to each other and you don't have any of this stuff automated, you are in an extremely precarious position. The moment something like this happens, you're going to be a little bit like flying in the dark. All the things, this is a nice, though, reinforcing thing, all the things that we might do in order to make it easier for us to develop and evolve our microservice architectures, to make it easier and faster for us to ship our software, things like automation, actually help us in the arena of security as well. The ultimate recovery is burn it down and start again. And yet it's amazing how many examples of organizations I've seen that don't have the ability to do that. Other things you should do is really get quite good at doing postmortems. Actually, running postmortems correctly, running them in a blameless style. If you want to know more, look up the term blameless postmortem. Often in the light of these incidents, people look for somebody to blame. So the recent BA outage, Louis Walsh, not Louis Walsh, I've forgotten his name, Mr. Walsh, who runs BAA's, the British Airways parent company, came out and basically said, we're not entirely sure what happened, but what we do know is that one person plugged in something they shouldn't have plugged in, and that's why we couldn't take off, our planes couldn't take off. And it's sort of like coming out immediately, throwing an employee under the bus at speed, and then saying, but now we're going to carry out an independent investigation on what happened. Meanwhile, if you're an employee at BA, you're not feeling great about yourself right now, are you? Because you think, well, any moment now, if anything goes wrong, I'm going to get thrown under the bus. John Allspaw once said, I think, that looking for the root cause of failure is like looking for the root cause of success. It doesn't happen. There isn't one reason that something fails. There are multiple reasons why something fails. Failure is a systemic issue. Sidney Dekker tells a story about these bombers in World War II, and they had an issue where when these bombers were coming into land at airstrips, that the pilots were engaging the flaps for the plane before putting the undercarriage down. So it's hydraulic flaps, hydraulic undercarriage. And they'd flick a switch, and they'd put the flaps down first, which meant the planes were just landing without their undercarriage down, without the wheels down. And they thought, well, the problem here is clearly the human being in charge, and so we're going to train them up more. And no, they kept coming in, and they kept engaging the flaps before engaging the undercarriage, and they were losing planes. And they said, right, well, what we'll do now is we'll court-martial people. So we'll line them up and shoot them. Right? Okay, that didn't work. We're just losing pilots now. Okay, what else can we do? And then they put a psychologist in the cockpit. And he looked at the cockpit, and the two little switches for the flaps and the undercarriage were just on the dashboard, just down quite low, and they were identical switches, one on top of the other. And all he did was he took one of those switches and he put rubber on it to make it like the wheel, like the undercarriage, and he made the other one, he replaced the switch, more like a flap. Plane stopped crashing. He'd created a cockpit and a setup in which people were making mistakes, and we blame the individuals. We like to look for a scapegoat. That's not how the world works. We create systems in which people are allowed to fail. If it's true that at BA, a human being plugged something in there rather than in there, and that caused a whole multinational airline to stop functioning, I think you can't blame that individual because we do make mistakes. And I think any system you create that is based on the premise that a human being will never make a mistake is a flawed system. And so when you're going through your postmortems, you're looking at what can happen, it is therefore important actually to try and make those postmortems blameless. Look at the system. Look at the multiple things that could have gone better, and look at the multiple things you could do to improve things. And also, make sure you review those postmortems. Many people do the postmortem and they get those things out, but they don't go back and look at those answers, look at those things. I've been involved in a couple of outages where people said, oh yeah, we knew we should have fixed that. This came up a couple of years ago and no one did anything about it. Reviewing those postmortems, going back over them again, and looking at the action plans you came up with and saying, well, we should do this, we should do that. The work that comes out, these are horrible situations when your site's been attacked, where your data has been breached. But there are also learning opportunities. Any massive outage is a learning opportunity. Any small outage is a learning opportunity. Take the information that comes out of them, identify the work and the things that you want to do to change, and put that in your pipeline. Work around security is just like any other type of work you're going to do. So there we are. Hopefully this sort of model will help you in generic systems, not just microservice systems. So prevention, stopping the bad thing from happening, detection, knowing when it has, response, knowing what you're going to do when something bad happens, and recovery, thinking about how you're going to stand things back up right, not just your services and your systems, but also your people. And talked a little bit about how some of that applies in the context of microservices. I do have time for some few questions if people want to ask them, probably a couple of questions. Can I see anybody who has any questions about microservice security or application security? Can't see any hands. Well, look, you can come and find me afterwards. You can also ask me questions on Twitter @SamNewman. But thank you very much for your time.